Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Book Club of California's online and in-person program titled From Page to Stage and Back, The Theatrical Adventures of Writer and Illustrator Edward Gorey. My name is Kevin Kosick, and I'm the Executive Director for the Book Club of California, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here to the club rooms and joining us online and host the program this evening. So thanks for being here. For those of you that might be new to the Book Club of California, we are a nonprofit member and donor supported organization that is dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of the book and the book arts. Oftentimes we do that with focus on the history and the literature of California and the West. The book club publishes limited edition, finely made books. We have a scholarly journal, and we have keepsakes for our members. We host a year-round series of exhibitions and programs, just like the one this evening, on topics including fine printing, design, typography, bookbinding, collecting, California history, and much, much more. Now, if you're not a member of the book club, or if your membership has lapsed and you're interested in what we do, please consider joining our century-long tradition. Membership dues are modest, the benefits are many, and we simply can't do the work of the book club without the support of our members. So I encourage you to go online to bccbooks.org to learn more about us, to join, or to donate to the book club. And now, tonight's program. From Page to Stage and Back, The Theatrical Adventures of Writer and Illustrator Edward Gorey. Our speaker is Carol J. Verburg. Now, Carol Verburg is a San Francisco writer and an award-winning playwright and theater director. On the theater side, we have Spin, or Twilight of the Bohemians. It was a winner of the Ashland New Plays Festival in 2011, and Centenary Stage Company's Women's Playwrights Series in 2012. The Abduction was a winner of the Utah Shakespearean Festival's 2001 Plays in Progress series. Her best-selling books include Ourselves Among Others and The Environmental Predicament. She has written crime fiction stories and novels and diverse historical and biographical nonfiction as well. Now, Carol Verburg studied theater with the legendary directors David Wheeler and Robert Scanlon at the American Repertory Theater's Institute for Advanced Theater Training at Harvard University. She graduated from Mount Holyoke College with honors in creative writing, where she wrote the pioneering 1968 rock musical, We Could Save the World. I'm so curious. That might be our next production here. Tonight, Carol Verburg, a longtime collaborator with Edward Gorey, will talk about a little-known aspect of writer and illustrator Edward Gorey's career. Now, Edward Gorey's creations as a book artist are distinctive, right? Sparse, oblique storylines paired with intricate, oblique drawings. Yet even his most ardent fans may not know that the author and illustrator of The Beastly Baby, The Doubtful Guest, and The Curious Sofa also directed these and dozens of unpublished texts on stages from Cape Cod to Los Angeles. In her new book, The Theatrical Adventures of Edward Gorey, which we do have copies here, and I think you'll be signing some at the end of the evening for those of you who are in the room. In this book, The Theatrical Adventures of Edward Gorey, our speaker will talk about some of the hidden gems that Gorey transformed from script to manuscript and vice versa, and how his lifelong curiosity about form was shaped by his experiments with collaboration. Now, if you have questions for our speaker and you're here in the room and you can hold them to the end, that would be great. If you're joining us on Zoom, you can use the chat and the Q&A functions in Zoom to put your questions and comments, and I'll come back at the end of the talk. It's about 30-ish minutes. Then we'll have time for questions and answers, and we'll take them from folks on Zoom and from you here in the club rooms. Now that's enough of me. Let me bring our speaker to the stage. Please join me in welcoming Carol Verburg.
Thank you, Kevin. I have no idea I did all those things. It's really marvelous.
Get rid of this note that's on the screen. You can't see it because you're here. Let me see
Okay,
if I can
please
get
do.
this. I think I have to go this way. There we go. See, there's this little
Oh, yeah.
note here.
Don't show this. Okay.
I can't quite get to it though. There we go.
There we go.
Oh. Back for here for you. And now you're
All right.
Nobody needs to see that.
I have to say it is an honor and a delight to be here in this beautiful space full of books and people who love them. I've enjoyed so many interesting presentations and exhibitions here. I really recommend becoming a member of the Book Club of California. It's really brightened up my life. All kinds of wonderful surprises. And also a shout out to Summerlee Kashar at the Cartoon and the Cartoon Art Museum. They are kindly supplying books tonight in case you want to adopt one and take it home with you. Think of it as like a cat, only it doesn't require cleaning up after, and it provides endless entertainment. So how many of you are fans of the author, artist, and illustrator Edward Gorey? Yes, yay. I found that people who know his name but are hazy about his work usually recognize at least one of his iconic images. His animated opening credits for PBS's Masterpiece Mystery Series. His sinister little alphabets and storybooks. And please feel free, if you have this memorized, to chime in. A is for Amy, who fell down the stairs. B is for Basil, assaulted by bears. And everybody's favorite, N is for Neville, who died of ennui. Or his Tony Award-winning designs for Dracula. Did anyone here see the Edward Gorey production of Dracula? All right. Did any of you ever see a theater piece that Edward Gorey wrote or directed? And the $64,000 question, back when that was still a lot of money. Did you ever see Edward Gorey perform on stage? Well, here he is as the telegraph boy in his short play Wallpaper on Cape Cod in 1996. We did a reading of Wallpaper in San Francisco in 2000, not with him in that role, at the Cartoon Art Museum to celebrate his 75th birthday. Summerlee can tell you about their current exhibition celebrating the Gorey centennial this year, 2025, 100 years since he was born, 25 years since he died. They're at 7081 Beach Street next to Ghirardelli Square. And you can see the originals of some of the art that's in the Theatrical Adventures. The book is subtitled Rare Drawings, Scripts, and Stories because I wrote it at the request of Edward's executor, Andreas Brown. Publish Gorey's scripts. Andy ran the legendary Gotham Book Mart after Francis Steloff, and he also managed the business side of Edward's career. It drove Andy crazy that with collectors stalking him for the next signed, numbered, Gorey whatever, Edward frittered away his sunset years doing theatrical productions. Making giveaways like postcards and programs. When Edward died in April 2000, he left a treasure trove of ephemera, posters, t-shirt designs, and so forth, and a fat box of scripts. Andreas Brown was right. This was original work by a major artist. It deserved to be seen. And I was the go-to person since I'd produced and assistant directed most of Edward's shows. But it was more complicated than he realized. Take Dracula. Edward read Bram Stoker's novel when he was 7. Not a big fan. Fast forward 40 years, he's become a successful freelance book designer and author who spends winters in Manhattan and summers with his family on Cape Cod. He gets a phone call from the brand new Nantucket Stage Company. Mr. Gorey, we're putting on Dracula. Can you help us out and design the set? Edward gave his standard answer. Oh, sure, why not? This is how he got so many cats. He never could say no. He always said, oh, sure, why not? But it was more complicated than he realized. They'd already hired a local artist to design the posters. Their performance space was a school auditorium, the Cyrus Pierce Auditorium Theater. Edward Gorey's sinister reputation might seem like an ideal match for Dracula, but his expertise was small, intricate, two-dimensional drawings. The only theater he'd done was at the Francis Parker School back in Chicago and the Poets Theater at Harvard. So how does he design this classic turn-of-the-century melodrama for a stage the size of a living room? My friend Erwin Terry, who's a Gorey collector and stained glass artist, investigated. You can read the full story in the Theatrical Adventures, but briefly, Edward knew 2 things from the plays he'd worked on. He needed to make the space visually striking and plausible for the audience, and functional and comfortable for the actors. So he created one basic set that could become 3 different locations. Dr. Seward's library, which you see here, his daughter Lucy's bedroom, and the crypt in Count Dracula's castle. The core of the set was a fixed framework of 5 arches that encircled the back of the stage. To change the location, the stagehands would fill some of the arches with panels or drapes, leave some open for entrances and exits, and switch the furniture. Visually, Dracula was stunning. Everything, set in costumes, was black and white, with one splash of red in each act. Although the director, Dennis Rosa, later told me on a Muni bus that was his idea, the show became known as the Edward Gorey production of Dracula. It was such a big hit, producer John Wolpe vowed to take it to New York. More complications. First, he didn't have the rights. That's a whole story in itself. Then a Broadway stage is many times the size of a living room. Edward couldn't just enlarge his drawings. He had to massively change the scale without losing the look. You can see in this production photo by Martha Swope, who I wish I could have met, how his original 5 arches multiplied to fill the Martin Beck theater space. Edward told the New York Times critic Mel Gusso, "I'm only too conscious of not being a real set designer or a real costume designer or a real anything." Meaning he was an artist and this was a job for an engineer. Think about it. Every time a new actor stepped in as Dracula, Jeremy Brett was one, Raul Julia, they had to build a new coffin to fit him. Luckily, they included the great scenic supervisor, Lynn Pechtal. And his book is absolutely fabulous. If you're interested in the ultimate intricacies of set design, Lynn Pechtal is the author to look for. By courier between Edward's summer attic on Cape Cod and the Martin Beck Theater in New York, Gorey and Pechtold reconceived every part of the set. And Edward's small two-dimensional drawings were transformed into a large, moving, three-dimensional machine. With success came merchandise. Edward agreed to design a deluxe new version of the Bram Stoker novel, Home, and to create a 3D, three-location Dracula toy theater. If you go to see the Cartoon Art Museum's exhibition, they've got the toy theater on display until August, complete with characters, furniture, and coffin. This scene is Lucy's bedroom. Again, each new iteration meant a whole new round of recalibrating and redrawing. So Dracula for Edward Gorey was a lesson in three-dimensional set design and also in commercial theater. Interesting, challenging, but not his cup of tea, really. Edward preferred the creative chaos he'd come from at the Poets Theater, where he'd collaborated with other post-war Cantabrigians like Alison Lurie, Frank O'Hara, John Ashbery, Donald Hall, Bunny Lang, where everybody did everything and had lots of pseudonyms, where you could try any kind of experiment you liked and somebody would love it. Words spoke louder than action at the Poets Theater. The pen was mightier than wooden stakes, bites on the neck, and wolfbane. Plots unfurled slowly. In Edward's scripts, they might not unfurl at all. He reveled in language, especially wordplay, puns, anagrams, and most of all, double meanings. Erwin Terry, the Gorey collector and sleuth, found a title page Edward drew in those days, The Worsted Monster, a Medieval Tale by Edward Gorey. I suspect his train of thought was something like, what's worse than a monster? A worsted monster! And he set it aside. 20 years later, while he was sweating over the Dracula toy theater between Nantucket and Broadway, what should appear in the National Lampoon, of all places, but a 2-page script, The Worsted Monster by Edward Gorey. No title page, no medieval tale. This little play came wreathed in a lengthy German provenance and clouds of persiflage. And a pop-out toy theater, complete with actors, furniture, a grotto, and an oracular watering can. A footnote offers several ways of putting it together, all of them unsatisfactory, it assures us, adding, you will find the play itself is quite unplayable, and you had much better shut yourself in a closet with a flashlight and imagine the whole thing going on inside your head. Meanwhile, John Wolpe knew that producing a Broadway hit opens a short, sweet window when you can do any project you like. Thanks to Dracula, Edward Gorey was hot. 2 drama students from the University of Kentucky had created a musical review from his best-known works called Gorey Stories. John Wolpe scooped it up. Edward didn't see this as having much to do with him, but he agreed to design a set. Gorey Stories opened on Broadway exactly 1 year after Dracula and closed after 1 night. Blame the newspaper strike. Without ads or reviews, nobody knew it existed. Edward evidently concluded, in that case, he might as well stage his own work his own way. He got a partial chance to do that in 1985, when a dancer from his hero George Balanchine's American Ballet Theater partnered with the composer of Gorey Stories on a new musical review. Tinned lettuce. This time, this is a sketch, by the way. He did, this is just how he would work things out visually before reaching the final version. So Edward provided the script, and this time it was 19 short stories, ballets, and recitations that had never been seen by anyone but their author. And the title he provided also, Tinned Lettuce. All of his titles for his own plays followed pretty much that same pattern, an adjective and a noun that seem to have nothing to do with each other. But if you think in a really subtle way, you can find some kind of bizarre wordplay going on there. The set for this is 2 can openers and a can of lettuce. So it ran 10 days, literally on Broadway, but at the wrong end of town at NYU. New York Times critic Mel Gusso approved. This is Edward Gorey land, a crepuscular county near the town of lesser evil, where everything seems to be taking place in a fen at twilight. Edward used his Dracula earnings to buy a crepuscular house in the Cape Cod village of Yarmouthport. Aside from being on a sandbar south of Boston, this was Agatha Christie land. You couldn't swing a golf club without hitting a theater. Edward met an excellent director, Jeannie Stevens. 10 years after Dracula, her Magical Oysters theater company opened Lost Shoelaces in the old Woods Hole fire station. For a script, Edward again provided a sheaf of texts he'd written but hadn't illustrated or published, with 2 exceptions. Les Échanges Malandreux he'd released 2 years ago as a flip book in a hand-sewn limited edition. Each page had a character drawn at the top and a line of dialogue lettered at the bottom, but they were unconnected. Literally, you could flip the speaker left and the speech right, or vice versa, for hundreds, he claimed thousands of pairings, both horizontally and vertically. To put this engineering marvel on stage, he had to take a different approach. More like a traditional book, in that the pairings were limited in number and fixed in content, like a couplet on a double-page spread. 2 actors walked on stage and each spoke a line, one a question, the other an answer. The characters and the speeches were both still unrelated, but they were linked by the context and the audience's expectations into what looked like a dialogue. This became one of Edward's favorite theatrical techniques, juxtaposition. If the audience inferred a connection, that was their choice. Edward scoffed at meaning, on stage as in life. His typical script comprised 15 or so texts, each roughly 3 to 10 minutes long. Some were shaped like stories, tracking a group of characters through a series of incidents. Others were random sequences of sentences. Some of them rhymed. You really must see his Nancy Drew in limericks. Some were performed by actors, some by his own handmade puppets. Short musical or verbal breaks filled the spaces in between. In his 10 years of doing theater on Cape Cod, Edward wrote only 2 or 3 plays in the structural sense. No songs. Most of his dozen odd stage texts were reviews, which he called entertainments. The second previously published script in Lost Shoelaces was The Worsted Monster. Having declared it unplayable with 2-inch tall cardstock actors, Edward staged it with puppets. It worked fine when the performers were 8 inches tall, with movable arms, cotton glove bodies, and white papier-mâché heads. Rehearsing with the puppeteers triggered a crucial change in the script. During a break one night, someone remarked that the float inside a toilet tank is called a ball cock. Edward thought that was too hilarious. The oracular ball cock, much better than the oracular watering can. Actor Joe Richards, who worked in a hardware store, was dispatched to make one. Joe found an antique brass ball cock, mounted it on a hand drill, and rotated it, raising it up above the puppet screen and down again, uttering sepulchral warnings. If I were you, I should not take the pathway leading to the lake. I didn't see Lost Shoelaces. I moved to Cape Cod about the same time as Edward, but I was commuting in the opposite direction for a new theater workshop launched by Ray Martin Wells from the old Provincetown Players Circle. My debut project was also experimental, a stage adaptation of the most unadaptable thing I could think of, Kurt Vonnegut's novel Cat's Cradle, which has an unnamed narrator and ends with the world freezing solid. Edward came to see it at the Barnstable Comedy Club, where Vonnegut used to direct and perform. We sat talking and talking until the tavern closed. 2 years later, we staged Edward's first of 3 entertainments in Provincetown, Useful Urns. Edward placated Andreas Brown by creating 2 versions of the show's poster. A standard printed one for publicity and to sell at performances, and a lithograph for the Gotham bookmark to sell. Both sets signed and numbered. He placated his fans with a script that included some of his published stories, The Waterflowers, The Curious Sofa. And he entertained himself with some devilish experiments. One segment of the script, Conversation, was yet another version of Les Échanges Malentoureux, or rather 3 versions. The questions and answers were performed as dialogue in 3 different ways. You can see on the playlist, figure 8 movement, ballet-like, and urns, meaning the speakers were hidden by the 6.5-foot tall urns that Edward had built. And he hand painted them on styrofoam on the floor of this former bowling alley that we were using as our theater, with wooden legs and handles added by the chairman of the board, so they could be carried invisibly around the stage by the actors. He did similar variations with The Helpless Doorknob, a shuffled story by Edward Gorey. This is a deck of cards. You may have it yourselves, each with an illustration and a caption. A mysterious urn appeared in the grounds. Angus concealed a lemon behind a cushion. Alethea vanished from a picnic. He arranged the cards in 3 different sequences, 3 shuffled stories, if you will. One was acted out by the cast, one was performed by puppets, and one was recited by actors seated in rows, like an antique family portrait who passed a brown glass doorknob from speaker to speaker. If this sounds a tiny bit opaque, it was. The audience's favorite part of the show, and mine, was the stories. 2 of them were new, and they are wonderful. First, the enraged telephone. Here's how it opens. Taken ill while alone in the night, Jasper Fingerstall, the shipping magnate, managed to reach the telephone. He expired cursing it, heard only by the wrong number he'd been given, a Miss Etiola Elflock, who was upset for weeks afterwards. Edward's sketches from decades earlier suggest that he'd started writing The Enraged Telephone as a book, or possibly a magazine commission. This grid is labeled Town and Country in an obscure corner, hard to picture. Or even a stage play. He has one very detailed drawing of the telephone on a stand, as if with an overlay, as if it were going to be painted on a set wall. Or maybe one and the other, and then limbo. The other news story was The Enormous Wood. This one clearly started as a book. He actually began drawing it in a format so experimental that he quit a few spreads in. That was another Irwin Terry discovery. Unusually, the story is told in first person, in the voice of a little girl. Her mother is having an attack of the vapors and tells her to take her dear little brother out for a very long walk. We left the house. Big drops of rain hit us in the face. Not Edward's typical arm's length narration. The drawings, too, are a departure, not freeze frames, but panoramas across double-page spreads. Evidently, after he gave it up as a book, Edward realized it might work as a script. He renamed it The White Stone and tried it out in Tinned Lettuce at NYU. He was happy enough with the results to strip out the singing, except for one little ditty by Frederick, and stage it as a straight drama in useful urns, with a little girl narrator telling the story, a little girl character acting it out, and two supporting actors playing her mama and brother. This balance between action, narration, and dialogue was a revelation Edward would come back to. The following summer, he applied it to The Black Lobster, a rather ho-hum tale of crime on roller skates. With good choreography and a new layer of speeches added, it blossomed into The Blue Lobster, a zippy piece of comic theater. The actor's shiny blue lobster costume helped. Edward was now entrenched in indie theater. He would keep one foot there and one in books for the rest of his life, with a few toes in magazine commissions and standalone drawings. By his third and last summer show in Provincetown, Crazed Teacups, he was including more of his published pieces in his entertainments and writing new scripts. He also began staging odd bits by other writers, from Jane Austen to Hugo Ball. One of his new scripts was Verse Advice. Actually, it was a set of couplets, one of those interstices he had his actors walk on and recite between major scenes, wearing lampshade hats in this case. The person who today is here may by tomorrow disappear. The seaweed on the shore cries out, but only it knows what about. Typical Edward, we thought, being silly. Until a few months later, 12 illustrated panels of Verse Advice appeared as New Year's tips for 1993 in the New Yorker magazine. The last influence I want to mention wasn't so much between stage and page as a multiple crossover involving books, plays, puppet shows, and music. You remember The Worsted Monster, Edward's mock German script and toy theater that appeared in the National Lampoon. 30-some years later, the target of its mockery struck back. Edward was so tickled to hear about the international hit Shock-Headed Peter that he was almost tempted to hop on a plane. Instead, he tracked down Martin Jock, frontman for the Tiger Lilies, and I went to London and saw Shock-Headed Peter, which is so brutally Gorey-esque, you can't believe these two guys were not twins separated at birth. Long story short, they agreed to meet on Cape Cod in April 2000 to discuss collaborating on a Gorey album with the Kronos Quartet. But, minor chord, it was more complicated than they thought. In February 2000, Edward's cardiologist advised him to get a pacemaker. He opted to punt till after Easter. There were the Tiger Lilies, and I was coming back from San Francisco, and a couple of his friends from New York. but his dicky ticker did not wait. And that was the Gorey end. The show, in this case the album, went on without its main character. It had Edward's design and Edward's stories set to someone else's music, just like the Gorey beginning. Thank you.
Well, we have time for questions. Let's see if we have any questions here in the club rooms. And if you're joining us on Zoom, now's the time to put your questions and comments in the chat and the Q&A, and I can pull those up on my phone. We'll start here in the front, and then John.
I have two questions. What triggered him to express himself in this way? Was it his background in his family, or it just developed all by itself?
Well, his answer to people asking him questions like that in interviews was usually, oh, I don't know. Somebody, Johnny Carson and other people asked him, well, you were self-taught to read? And he said, yeah. And they said, well, how did you do that? And he said, I don't know. You know, you're 3.5 and suddenly the words are cohering into stories, but you know, it's not. So I don't know that he had any theory about this. And a part of my job in being enough in sync with him to help him do exactly what he wanted to do, but in a way that wasn't completely obscure to everybody else who saw it, was not to ask how, why. He really stayed away from those questions, as I said. And there are so many people writing so many books, and there will be more delving into that. But the people who knew him tended to have a great respect for his privacy and his desire never to explain anything. I mean, I would even ask him a question like, that marvelous drawing of the woman standing under the elephant, how did that come about? Was it the elephant and then the woman, or the woman and then the elephant? Oh, I don't know. You know, so I really can't tell you. Yeah.
I had one more.
Sure.
No.
Have you had an exhibition at the main library, at the special collections perhaps, or has there been a thought of doing that?
I don't know that anyone's thought of doing that, but we have the wonderful exhibition at the Cartoon Art Museum, which I really advise you to go see. And I have to add here, don't miss the Batman room. Whatever you may think of Batman, it's really cool. And in fact, Edward Gorey made a Bat t-shirt. He gave me one. It has his own version of the bat signal on the front, and it glows in the dark. I discovered this because I turned out my closet light one night, and there's this glowing bat signal in my clothes closet. And I think that was how he liked things like that to come about. He wouldn't say, here is a t-shirt that glows in the dark with the bat signal on it. Anyway.
So the information for the Cartoon Art Museum exhibition is actually on the screen here in the club rooms and on Zoom. You can catch it there. It's through August 10th at the Cartoon Art Museum here in San Francisco. John, I said you
spoke a little bit earlier, but I asked you about funding.
Yes.
Can you speak up so we can hear, and then we might have to repeat it for the Zoom.
So I asked you before to talk about funding my memoir. I don't know if anyone knows who this funny was. Could you maybe talk a little bit more? Is this stuff that may have sort of quietly germinated in the Poets Theater at Harvard? And I mean, she was a costume person. She was from the Boston family. It was a very bizarre world. And Alison Lurie paints her as this great figure, but utterly mad figure. I'm very, very curious. They were extremely good friends. That's the sort of essential friendship in poetry. Not entirely. Before really very. So do you have any idea that maybe, because that was his early work, so he was at Harvard, right? Or was he just a hanger on?
Well, the situation at Harvard at that time.
Can you rephrase
yes.
the question for?
Bunny Lang was indeed a very central figure in Edward's life, and the Poets Theater was indeed the sort of crucible where his ideas about theater, crucible is too strong a word, more like a gentle, double boiler. where his ideas about theater, which were very, very much tied in with language, as the poet's theater name implies, they were kind of counter to this was just after World War II. And all these guys were coming out of the service. Edward's, you really should take a look at the story about Edward's service in the army. It's beyond belief.
Was it episodic? He was very abbreviated.
Well, he didn't go in until 1944, so in that sense it was, but he had already been accepted at Harvard before the war, but he was deterred, and so were a lot of other people. So suddenly, after the war, you have all these incredible people who have been scattered all over the place and never would have thought of applying to Harvard or would have gotten in, converging on Cambridge, Massachusetts. Alison Lurie's husband was there studying for his PhD, I think, and she was kind of at loose ends, and she and Edward, who was called Ted at that time, would just go out on jaunts. She was working in I don't know what they called it, but what was allegedly the smutty books room in the Boston Public Library. Slutty in under lock and key. They kept all these books, and that was the genesis of the Curious Sofa, that they read them and there was nothing in them. They were just not that smutty. So and Allison was responsible for some other of Edward's books too, which again you can read all about. But Bunny Lang, someone called her the den mother of the Poets Theater. That she was her own person, as you were saying, just a real free spirit who came from an entitled enough background that she could really make that work as a woman at Harvard, which there were no women at Harvard, so there you go. But these creative talents converged with this backlash to the war and this opportunity that Harvard was creating for them to basically do whatever they wanted creatively and stage it. They found odd little places to do things, churches and whatnot. And it was all completely shoestring, but it was also off the radar. It was a free-for-all. It was whatever your creative talent, whatever direction you were led by your curiosity, you could find a way to do it. And that for him was very much what theater was for. And that stayed with him for the rest of his life. And that's why he didn't like New York theater so much. It was so much more bureaucratic. He really liked Cape Cod theater, especially since he had some enablers who were like I was running one. I ran a couple of different little theater companies over the course of time, and they were all very happy to entertain Edward's experiments.
Yeah, he did the illustrations for T.S. Eliot's famous book, Cat Coins. Do you think that had a role in inspiring the Broadway hit, the famous production Cats? Do you think this might have inspired that production?
Well, that's another great story, actually. And again, you really should read the book. But what happened was, here's Dracula 1, 1973, and then it took 4 years to get the rights and get it to Broadway. In between, Cats came out. Cats the musical came out. This was just Andrew Lloyd Webber off on a completely different plane, you might say, except for commercially, he and John Wolpe and the Dracula crowd were, everybody was looking at Broadway as a potential cash cow. So it occurred to somebody, since Edward was best known at that point as a book designer, that he would be, I think he'd already done some T.S. Eliot books, and somebody said, well, let's get Gorey, he likes cats. So he did the drawings for the book, which had no relation to the musical, except that it was based on the same source material. But it sold like hotcakes as soon as the musical came out, and it kept selling year after year after year. And although Dracula was what paid for his house, Cats was what paid for his life. T.S. Eliot's book of Old Possum's Book of Practical Cats, and the merchandise and everything else that, you know, little silver cat pins. It's just, my sister told me when I told her I was writing this book, she's a children's book publisher. She said, you should call it Cats. I said, it's not about cats. She said, which would people rather hear about, Edward Gorey's theater or cats?
Stephen,
Just one quick question. You keep saying getting the rights for the Broadway production, the rights to what?
The Balderton, what's the other guy's name? This script that was in one of the slides.
Obviously, Dracula's public domain.
Dracula's in public domain, but the
action.
script is not
I
in
see,
public
the
domain.
action.
And Dracula, as you might have noticed, I'm not sure if I can get back to the texts here. But Dracula, the book, I mean, if you ever need to fall asleep without medication, try reading Dracula.
Oh, I read it.
Okay,
I'll tell you about it.
okay, yeah. All right, well, but the script, you know, this was written or published in 1897. The script didn't come out until 1933. So by then, they had stripped away all the part about,
Oh, so this was not an adaptation from the 70s.
no, this was a
1930s,
definitive script that had fallen into desuetude, who knows how, I don't know how. But they specifically wanted to stage that version. I guess they thought, I saw it last summer, the Harwich Junior Theater, the Cape Cod Theater, it's now called, on Cape Cod, revived this script and did a production which had motifs based on Edwards and was kind of a tribute to
Is
him.
that the one that
So-
ends up being the Frank Langella movie?
Yeah, well, I don't know about the movie.
It was based on a play.
Yeah, but this script was what they had trouble getting the rights to. And I'm sure at that time there was probably, it wasn't like you could just say, oh, well, we won't use that script then, we'll do a different Dracula. John Wolpe only bought the summer amateur rights. He didn't have much money. He was, you know, someone at a cocktail party said, so ask Edward Gorey. And he thought, shoot, yes, why not? But they were just going from, you know, one move to the next, trying to stay afloat, trying to get this company afloat. And in fact, I don't want to go down too many rabbit holes in the course of answering your question, which is basically about the Dracula script, but they performing 3 plays on this little high school stage, they damaged it so badly that they were not allowed to come back. So that was, they tried to get a place somewhere else on Nantucket, but basically this was the pinnacle of the Nantucket Stage Company. So John Wolpe immediately, as soon as Dracula opened and people started flocking in, which was exactly what he'd hoped but did not dare to dream, he went and applied for the rights to transfer this script to New York, along with all the production that was attached to it. Dennis Rosa as the director, Edward Gorey as the designer, and someone else had already bought up the rights. And in the end, Edward Gorey wrote a personal letter to that guy who held the rights and said, I am not designing this for you. Either you let John Wolpe have the rights, he made the production, he made it a success, or I'm out of here. And that was how that happened.
How long did that take?
So 4 years.
One last question here in the room. Does anybody have a question? Because I think there's a great question on Zoom that we
Okay.
can close with. And it,
I guess the question is, can you tell us a little bit about the book?
Oh, sure. Well,
Maybe first the question from Zoom. It's really great.
yeah.
yeah, the question from
And
Zoom.
then we can digress and
Talk a little bit about
meander.
the book. You can come up and see it. We have an open copy. We have about 5 or 6 copies here for purchase if you want to acquire one for your library. But the Zoom question is, do you think that Gorey would have continued on with theater as his main artistic expression had he lived longer?
It was so hard for me to lose him that it is really hard for me to contemplate what his theater career would have done. We had both come to the point where we had accomplished what we set out to do, And then things were coming into the picture like the tiger lilies. I was spending winters out here trying to save the Eureka Theater, working in the literary department. So we had other enterprises, and then the theater where we were mainly working burned to the ground a week before his fatal heart attack. So that, I think, was what just really rung down the curtain on, in many, many senses.
What was the theater?
It's the Cotuit Center for the Arts, and it was a rehabbed mechanics garage. And when I asked him to design my set for Hamlet, which I directed in that space, I did not realize what a favor I was asking, because you imagine the walls of a mechanics garage, and they may be covered over now with drywall, but there's like a wall here, a little teeny wall over here, and then a big door, and and he went and measured everything and drew everything to scale, and it was just an unbelievably kind thing to do. And those drawings are now being shown for the first time at the Cartoon Art Museum.
So a few words about the book.
Yes. Well, as I said, Andreas Brown asked me to publish Edward's scripts. I quickly realized you couldn't do the scripts without the art. And the art was in cardboard boxes after Edward died, and so he knew where everything was, but he had this a little arcane filing system that involved Roman numerals, among other things. So it was a while before things got organized, like about 20 years. So finally, the archive was able to had an actual archivist and put everything into order in New York. And I was, I think, one of the first people to go in and roam through everything and find all the missing art that I had known about, that no one had seen for years, that had just gotten, detoured or lost, or nobody recognized it, because most people had not seen the theater productions in these little theaters on Cape Cod. So I sort of traded identifying a lot of the stuff they had that they didn't know what it was or what to do with it, for being able to use it in the book. And the Edward Gorey estate is officially the co-author of the book. But it starts with his childhood and how he started going to plays as soon as he was old enough, as I'm sure a lot of us did. And then became entranced with every kind of performing arts, including George Balanchine's American Ballet Theater, which really influenced his ideas about meaning and interpretation and the audience bringing their own view to things. So it's not an analytical book. It's mostly just gorgeous, weird art and unbelievably unusual and idiosyncratic scripts, and all the people who got drawn into this great web that formed around Edward, because he was an absolutely delightful person to work with. And most of the people who worked with him said the same thing. Lynn Pechtal, who was the pinnacle of New York set engineering, just loved working with him and worked with him on every show he did after that, after Dracula. So I don't know if that really even comes close to what you're asking, but I would say it's like a pirate's treasure. It's like, open sesame and walk in and discover all the just amazing things that a genius does when he's let loose on the world and goes into all kinds of different aspects of the arts.
Well,
He did write a puppet opera. That was his last completed piece, which is my very favorite of everything he did. And I hope it will be performed, because I directed it posthumously on Cape Cod, and I just adore it. It's called The White Canoe, and it has an alligator ballet, and it's just, and spirits of the swamp. And I was deciphering these notes that say spirits of the swamp, Loie Fuller sleeves. Well, I didn't know what that meant, but Linda and I just saw a Loie Fuller exhibit at the Legion of Honor, and there it is.
Well, with that, we'll give you a chance, if you're here in the club rooms, to come up and look at the book. But first, join me in thanking our speakers, Carol Verburg. Thank you very much. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you here in the club rooms and on Zoom for joining us for this program. You can register for any book club program online at bccbooks.org/programs or using the link in the email that you're probably getting from the book club. Thanks everyone for joining us. Please come again. If you have any questions, please reach out to me. I'm Kevin at bccbooks.org.